You are listening to the Mothergood Podcast, episode number 74. I'm your host, Emily Carney. We at Mothergood believe that there's no way to be a perfect mom, but many ways to be a good one. Our content is judgment-free within the context of evidence-based research. As many of you know, in addition to being a mom, which is my favorite job in the world, and also hosting this podcast, I'm an attorney, and I own my own law firm, The Carney Firm. I specialize in being general outside counsel for small businesses and also intellectual property matters such as registering a trademark and counseling and other intellectual property matters. I love helping small businesses, and I'm also a business consultant for them as well. So if you're a mama and you own your own business, I would be so honored if you would consider reaching out to me for a free consultation. You could reach me at emily@thecarneyfirm.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at attorney Emily. I'm also a mom-friendly lawyer. Some of my clients are mothers. I'm a mother. And so if you have a loud child in the background on a phone call with me, it does not matter to me whatsoever. As long as you're okay with it, I'm okay with it. And for a disclaimer, by law, I'm required to say that this is attorney advertising and also is not legal advice. Hi, Rosalia. Thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to the Mothergood Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Me too. Well, I know that we've, tried to reschedule this a lot and, my family, we had COVID and then you had something too. So I'm glad we finally were able to make this happen.
Yeah, we're both moms.
Yeah, exactly. This is such an important topic to me, consent, especially since I have a 4-year-old daughter who's just now starting to do different activities. And then also, a 1.5-year-old son. And my daughter just did Princess Camp this past week. And so I, logged onto your Instagram and ordered a bunch of your consent books because I just want to be really clear about that. And so it's something that's extremely important to me. But before we dive into consent and what it is, I'd love for you just to introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about who you are, what your background is.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. And I'm so glad that you were able to get some resources to get started on those conversations with your daughter.
Yes,
I'm a consent educator and child sexual abuse prevention specialist. And I work with parents to help them go from anxious to confident in having those body safety, boundaries, and consent conversations so that they can prevent abuse. And I work mostly with parents who are survivors. I'm a survivor myself, although I now consider myself a thriver and want to help other parents who are also survivors to learn how to navigate this topic with confidence, because it can be triggering for a lot of parents who haven't, gone through this experience themselves. And so, I help them navigate it, and I think for all parents, whether you're a survivor or not, to recognize that this doesn't have to be a scary topic, and we can actually dismantle the taboo of this conversation so that it becomes the norm to talk about it, because it's so prevalent today, more than ever, and people don't realize it. So part of my work is in creating awareness around the topic. I'm also the founder of Consent Parenting, which is the platform that I use to teach parents. I host the About Consent podcast, and I'm also the chair of the SAGE organization, which is leading the Brave movement, which is a very exciting new global initiative to end child sexual abuse, working with partners all over the world. So that's what I do. And I'm very excited to be here because this is my passion, is to share this information with others.
I'm so glad that you did start your Instagram page, and it is your passion to just get the word out, because to be honest with you, just as you said, it's a scary topic. It's a very scary topic for me as well. And I think it's just one of those that a lot of parents just try to avoid because it is very scary and uncomfortable. And since following your Instagram page and getting some of the resources, it's just given me the confidence to actually talk about it too, because it does seem a little bit taboo and embarrassing to talk about, but it is just so important.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the prevalence of, kids. I'm trying not to be like that triggering, and I don't know all the words for it, so maybe you can help me out here. But
Sure.
the prevalence of child abuse, maybe you can touch on that again, not to scare parents out there, because I know so many mom friends already are like worried about so many different things. So I don't mean to add one more thing
For
to
sure.
their worry plate, but maybe you could just touch on how prevalent it is in
Yeah.
society and even in the United States, because I think a lot of people just think it's kind of something of the past.
Yeah, for sure. So globally, the statistic is at an average, because it is different in different countries. But I'll give you a global statistic and then a US statistic. So globally, it's 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 10 boys that are abused. So that is a very high percentage. We're talking about 50% of the population, right? And as it relates to the United States, it's 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys. So not that
Wow.
far from the global the global average. And when we talk about these numbers, we also have to remember that this is a crime that is gravely underreported. So the numbers are likely much higher than that. And to add to that, and again, this isn't to make people scared. I want people to receive this information and acknowledge that, wow, it is bigger than we realized, and there's so much that we can do about it. So we don't have to be scared of the problem. Let's focus on the solutions, right? So just to give you a little bit more insight as to, different ages are also experiencing this in different ways. So there was a recent statistic I just learned at a conference in Brussels that is specifically geared towards ending online exploitation and violence against children. And they were looking at data that talks about from 2010 to now, right? So 12 years, the increase of exploitation, the reports that have been received in that time span has gone up by 6,000%.
Oh my gosh.
And this number, was definitely compounded because of the pandemic. So many kids, went online,
Really?
but then also just so many other reasons why this has become a problem. And I won't go into all of that right now, but just to give you sort of a baseline of how prevalent this issue has become. And a lot of people tend to think that it is an adult to child issue, but it is increasingly becoming a peer-to-peer issue. In fact, 40% of abuse that happens to children by someone that they know and trust, 40% of that is peers. And that number is on the increase. So that's something that I think a lot of parents should be aware of, and why it's so important to teach kids from a very young age and not wait too long.
Right. I think I saw a statistic like that on your Instagram page about the peer-to-peer abuse. And that's something, honestly, that I didn't really think about. I was always just thinking about more in terms of a parent or an adult, that sort of situation. And so when I was talking to my daughter recently and reading her the children books that you recommended, that's one thing that I made sure I emphasize. It's, it's not just adults, it's kids too. No one else can, touch you, and all these different things. And I was just so shocked to that I didn't think about it, and also that is such a high statistic. It's just mind blowing.
Yeah.
And going back to the underreported aspect of it, I think that's so important to emphasize how this is underreported, and just sexual crimes in nature or in general. I personally have a few friends, unfortunately, who have been sexually assaulted, and I think the vast majority of them, I'm thinking actually only one probably reported it, but the rest never did. And it's just very embarrassing. They didn't want to be known as, quote, that girl, have that stigma, and that's how they're known for in the community and all that. So, I mean, just personally, I can attest that that's so true, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, and I actually have a post on all the reasons why children don't report. There's so many, and all of it stems back to the fact that parents just don't know how to have these conversations. And so they're not giving their children the tools and the skills to be able to report, to know that it's safe to report, and to be able to access help so that they don't get stuck in repeat situations or situations that escalate. So when we when we become proactive in this, we want to help kids, obviously, to prevent this from happening. But because of how prevalent it is, there is a chance, regardless of how much you do, there is a chance that someone could offend on a child. And we want kids to know the second part of abuse prevention is how to access help so that it doesn't happen again, right? We don't want children to be re-victimized. We want them to get the support that they need so that they can process what happened and be able to do boundary repair and move forward, right? So it's really key that parents think about, yes, prevention is important, but also giving kids the tools for what to do if something does happen. Because we tell kids a lot of the times, no one should touch you. That's,
right.
What's inappropriate and what's appropriate. But a lot of times we don't give kids exit strategies along with that. So I'll give you a quick example. In Tarana Burke's book, Tarana Burke, if you're not familiar with who she is, she's the founder of the Me Too movement. And she wrote a book this past fall called Unbound. And she shares her own story of abuse as a child. Her first experience was as a child, later as an adult. But a lot of times people also don't realize that abuse can happen to an adult, and is typically because it's easy for that person to be re-victimized because of their history, right? And we know that an example of this is that 80% of trafficking survivors, of human trafficking survivors, that are sold for sexual purposes, 80% of them are child sexual abuse victims or survivors. The level of re-victimization for that demographic is much, much higher. But not to digress. So the reason that I bring that up is because Tarana Burke shares her story of what happened, and very much like most moms will say, don't let someone touch you there. Be very careful. Don't bring unnecessary attention to yourself. Like as a child gets older, that may be the messaging that they get, and so they feel very responsible for preventing that abuse. And if it does happen, they feel like it's somehow their fault. If they tell, then they're going to disappoint the parent because they didn't obey or they didn't adhere, to the warnings, right? And so unfortunately, a child will feel afraid to tell a parent. So if we want to make sure that when we're giving kids these tools, we need to know that it's not their job to prevent abuse. That's our job to give them the skills to recognize what abuse is so that if it were to happen, they can report. But our other job as parents that can really reduce the risk of abuse is to talk to the adults in our children's lives, including the parents of the kids that they hang out with. Because we would then probably encourage those parents to start also educating their kids, which reduces the likelihood of peer-to-peer abuse. So there's lots of things that we can do. When I share about this information, I also want parents to know that you have so much more power and influence, and there are so many more resources and tools and skills that you can develop now versus 10, 20 years ago that our parents didn't have. So we have so much more of an advantage to prevent this now than ever. So even though this is an increasing problem, there are also increasing solutions. So that's really good news.
Yeah, no, that's so wonderful. My mother, actually, she mentions that all the time. Whenever I find different resources for topics, she always says, "Oh, that wasn't available when you kids were younger." And so I really am thankful for all of those resources. It's just something that I wanted to touch on that you had mentioned, as you said that children are so scared to report it. And just going back to when I had mentioned the few friends that I have who are survivors, that they didn't even want to tell anyone in their lives as adults and when they were assaulted as adults. So I can't even imagine children having to bring up that topic because no one really likes talking about it. I mean, parents don't even really like talking to their kids about sex in general. I mean, everyone I know, their parents either never talked about sex, like consensual sex in general, or just maybe talked about it once embarrassingly and then moved on. So that doesn't really surprise me at all that that's such a very difficult conversation to have. I wanted to rewind a little bit and just get back to the basics on what consent actually is, because obviously you know what it is and I know what it is, but just recently, until recently, I didn't realize how complex it is. And
Mm-hmm.
so maybe you can give a simple definition and then we can get into some of the nuances of what invalidates consent, like coercion and, special relationships between individuals and those sorts of things.
Sure, sure. Yeah, getting a clear definition is key. So I want to start by saying that consent education and abuse prevention education are actually two different things. And consent education is actually the foundation of abuse prevention. So they intersect, they intertwine, and they interplay, but they are two different things. And so my philosophy in particular of teaching abuse prevention education starts with the foundation of helping kids understand the concept of body autonomy, boundaries, and consent. So there's three parts to it. And so in order to understand consent, you have to understand the concept of body autonomy. And so for kids, you want to simply say, your body belongs to you. And that is body autonomy, right? So the fact that your body belongs to you means that you get to say what happens to and with your body. So that's how we want to explain it to kids. And then that brings in the concept of boundaries, right? When you get to say what happens, that means that you have the right to set what are called boundaries, right? And we want to give kids the idea of physical boundaries, right? Is that comfort level of, that space between you and another person? Where is that comfort level for you, right? And so helping them to figure out what their physical boundaries are is going to be important, helping them understand what their emotional boundaries are. So do you want to receive a hug and a kiss from grandma, or would you prefer a different way to, express, that greeting? So we want to explain to them that they have a right to set those boundaries. So we want kids to figure out, what are my boundaries, right? What are those things that I'm comfortable with and not comfortable with? And that's going to be an ongoing process. They will learn it as they go as well, but they'll come up with some basic ones, right? I think kids, when they get to a certain age, they become very self-aware and they want to start being able to exercise that independence. So they'll, develop those boundaries. And then we want to teach them how to implement those boundaries, how to vocalize. Hey, grandma, I don't feel like a hug today, but how about a high five? Or, I'm just not feeling like snuggling today. Maybe later, right? So how do we help them learn how to vocalize those boundaries? And then consent is actually the permission. So if grandma wants to give you a hug, she has to ask permission, aka consent, right? So it's really just an interchange of language, but it's essentially what we want kids to understand. No one should just do what they want to you. They should ask, and you have a right to say yes or no. Now, for young children, and as parents, we are their stewards and guardians, and our job is to keep them healthy and safe. So we want to let them know there are some situations where we have to override your body autonomy for health and safety reasons. For example, when we're crossing the street, you don't know how to cross the street by yourself just yet. So I have to hold your hand, but I'm going to give you some options. You have the option of having me carry you across the street. You have the option of holding my hand when we cross the street, or you can be in the stroller when we cross the street. You got some options, right? So we still want to give kids the ability to practice boundary setting. Oh, I'd rather do this than that, right? So that's essentially how we would explain it to a young child, to give them that basic foundation of, you have the right to your body, you have a right to your boundaries, and people should be asking for consent, as well as you should be asking others for consent. So we want to make sure that we're also instilling the idea that it is a two-way street. The same with children. Your friend should ask you if they can hold your hand or if they can, play with you. No one should just push you, so you want to talk about some of those elements of it. And essentially, that's how we can explain the concept of consent to children very simply for them to grasp and start to practice. And then from that is what we build on for abuse prevention.
Yeah, I really like that, where you're pointing out the points or the instances where it invalidates consent. That's something that one of the recent pediatrician visits with my daughter that the pediatrician even brought up too. She said, no one can touch you in these places except for, mom and dada when they're, diaper change, obviously, and then the doctor, So I really like that she was very clear about that. And so I think that that's really important because you do want to teach kids when it is and is not appropriate for someone to touch them without their consent in those sorts of situations so they can really understand it. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
So I know that that's how we explain consent to little kids as a permission of, yes or no. Could we maybe expand a little bit on that for adults? Because I think that most adults really don't understand the consent issue. And I just want to expand on that, not necessarily to convey that to children, but just to educate parents as well as what is and isn't consent. Because honestly, I think that the vast majority of adults don't even really understand that. Some nuances of consent that I've recently come across are, instances of when someone might change their mind, right? Or maybe they'll consent to a certain aspect of something and not something else. Like I just watched a TV show recently that was, someone was on trial for sexual assault, and it started off the encounter started off with kissing, and the person consented to the kissing, but then once it started to go further, then the person didn't consent. And so there was a little confusion on the jury as to, okay, well, if they were okay with kissing and they were consenting with kissing, then why is it sexual assault if they changed their mind or said no to the further thing? So there's kind of like a sliding scale, I think, of, when consent starts, and it can end at any time. And maybe it's just consent as to certain aspects, all those sorts of nuances. So maybe you can touch on that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's actually something that we want to even teach young kids about consent, that consent can always be withdrawn. So if grandma, wants a hug today and you consent to that, that doesn't mean that grandma can just give you a hug anytime she wants. She still has to ask the next time. And so similarly with adults, we should be checking in, because when we switch to a different activity, we're needing to check in, is this activity okay? Maybe it's okay for grandma to hug you, but now she wants to give you a kiss and you don't want to kiss, right? So we're switching activities. That's a different thing. We're not talking about the same thing anymore. And so similarly with adults, we first of all need to understand that consent can be withdrawn. You get to be an active participant in what's happening to you and with you, and you get to change your mind about your body. So ultimately, consent is something that we need to understand can be withdrawn, and is something that needs to be consistently communicated. And we can do that in a variety of ways, but the lack of affirmation, that this is continuing to be okay, doesn't necessarily mean that that is consent. We need to see some visual cues, some facial cues, some body cues. We need to be tuning in, to what's happening in that experience to make sure that the other person is still willing to continue that activity, right? So we, in this particular case, I think unfortunately, in a lot of courtrooms, there is what continues to influence a lot of lawyers and judges and juries is rape culture, right? There's still a lot of victim blaming that happens. Oh, well, she was wearing this and she was drunk and she flirted with me and this and that. And so therefore I took all of that as the assumption that it meant yes. That is a presumption that has been created by rape culture. And unfortunately, it doesn't apply when we're talking about what are the definitions of consent, right? There are people that want to bend and twist those definitions to fit whatever that narrative is that they're trying to present, right? So what we can say with definity is that consent is something that can be withdrawn, and it requires willing participants that are verbalizing or physically showing that they are actively participating, that they are interested in participating. And so that can be that they have verbalized a yes, that they are enthusiastic. and that they haven't been coerced, that they haven't been manipulated into the situation, right? Unfortunately, in Canada right now, which is where I live, there was a Supreme Court decision about intoxication and extreme intoxication, rather, as a sort of an out, an excuse for, well, both parties were intoxicated, therefore they couldn't make a wise decision. So there is a lot of ongoing change as it relates to the law and how consent is interpreted. Unfortunately, in the United States, there is no one definition of what consent means. And that is very problematic because this is what creates a lot of cases where the victim does not receive justice because of the way that the laws or the terms are interpreted. So, again, going back to how we as parents need to understand this for children is that we want them to know consent can be withdrawn. You ultimately always get to say. And this is why we want kids to also practice boundary setting, to have the skills developed to be able to verbalize what they want or don't want, to give permission or not to give permission, to be able to be free to express themselves so that if they were ever in a situation like this as an adult, they can be as clear as possible about what they want or don't want happening with their body. And we can do this from a very young age, which has nothing to do with sex and has everything to do with bodily autonomy, boundaries, and permission. And so when we start from that foundation, it will continue to evolve as the child grows to see how it can apply in different situations. And ultimately, once they become intimate with someone else, excuse me, as a young adult, then they can apply what they've learned.
I'm so glad you brought up the rape culture because that's a big elephant in the room that's really hard to overcome. And that's something I had in my notes that I wanted to ask you about. What are some ways that we can talk to our kids to overcome that rape culture? Because I know that that's the negative voice in pretty much every victim's head. Well, at least every victim's head that I've spoken with, that everyone feels that guilt. And I've, read stories of other women who have gone through it as well, that whenever something happens to them, their first reaction most of the time or all of the time is to blame themselves, right? And then so I think a lot of the rape culture, not only is it external, but it's internal as well. What are some ways that we can talk to our kids about it to overcome it so that they can hopefully be shameless about it, but then also maybe just some tools that they can reason within themselves to overcome the shame themselves as much as possible?
Yeah. So, wow, that's a really powerful and deep question. I think it depends a lot on the age of your child. I think when one of the ways that we can start to dismantle rape culture is really by teaching kids about them honoring the rights of others just as much as their own rights should be honored, right? And so we want to make sure that we're raising children who are not going to grow up to become abusers. We tend to focus when we're talking about looking at the world through the lens of rape culture, we tend to focus on let's protect kids, make sure that our kids know how to set boundaries and all of that, which is great. However, if we're looking at it through that lens, we're always focused on making sure that kids, know what skills that they should have to be able to say no and how to report and all of those things. But we don't focus on what are the things that we should also be teaching children about how to respect the rights of others and make sure that they're listening and tuning in, that they're learning how to read facial cues and body cues and what to do if someone says no, because a lot of times parents are afraid of their children receiving a rejection. And that is actually something really powerful that children should be able to learn how to cope with as something that is just a natural consequence in the world. Not everyone, it's not personal. It's just that person doesn't want to hug right now. That doesn't mean that you're a bad kid or that they don't like you. It just means that they don't want to hug right now. Just like you wouldn't, if you don't feel like having a hug, no one should force you or make you feel bad about that, right? So you shouldn't do the same equally, right? So we want to make sure that we're also teaching both ends, because if you think about how we teach young women in the world to be careful when they go out, don't go out by yourself, don't go to a party and get drunk, don't wear provocative clothing, don't do this, don't do that. So there's all of these messages that we are telling women to do so that they don't attract the wrong attention. That was how I was raised. And it very much was something that I pushed back against because I didn't want to believe that. And I gambled on it. I ended up at one point being date raped and didn't know that consent could be withdrawn. And so I put myself in all these situations that I thought were my fault because I didn't know all of this, previous information that, that I, regardless of what I do, does not invite someone to violate my body.
Right. Just because you don't follow the rules that people recommend doesn't mean that it's your fault somehow.
Exactly. And so that's one of the ways that we can start to introduce this idea to young children is that, if someone doesn't respect their boundaries, it's not their fault. Even if they set the boundary and the boundary was pushed or crossed or violated, that it doesn't mean that they did anything wrong. And so we want kids to know that from a very early age, because unfortunately, typically 90% of abuse happens by people that a child knows and trusts. They will have developed a friendship or relationship with that person, and that person could manipulate the child into somehow believing that it was their fault. So we want to introduce that idea very early on to children that, if they understand their rights and they have set a boundary and that boundary was not respected, that doesn't mean that they did anything wrong, and that they have every right to report that so it doesn't happen again, because their safety matters. Mm-hmm. Their safety is the most important thing to you. So that their safety trumps everything else. And that means that your love is unconditional no matter what happens to them. It means that they won't be blamed for what happens to them. That means that if they made a mistake, that it doesn't mean that mistake was what caused it to happen, right? So we want to give children all of these, this understanding, excuse me, because then as they grow up, they understand how that translates to their particular age and stage and relationships, right? So as they get older and they have friends who want to peer pressure them about something, and then they feel bad about the decision that they made and somehow it compromises their safety, they can still recognize that they made a mistake, but ultimately what happened to them was not their fault. It was the fault of the person who caused or inflicted the harm and crossed the boundary. So this keeps interpreting itself into romantic relationships and into, relationships in the workplace. And so we want to introduce this idea as early as possible that consent can be withdrawn, that everyone's rights matters, including their own. And then how to learn to check in and interpret those, facial cues, physical cues, body cues, language. All of these things are nuanced and they require ongoing conversations throughout our children's lives, right? Mm-hmm. So this isn't something that we're going to teach when our kids, are just in elementary school. And then, as they get older, they should be good because now they can, communicate. These are nuances that we really need to keep having these conversations as our children grow into different ages and stages. And that's how we can start to dismantle rape culture, because it is so ingrained in the way that we interact in the world, and then ultimately how that impacts survivors from reporting. And again, this is one of the reasons why it's so underreported, because there's all this stigma and shame and taboo, because we're not having these conversations early on.
Mm. I want to touch a little bit on grooming before our podcast ends, because you did mention that it usually, abuse usually happens between someone who your child has a relationship with. So I think it's really important to touch on that. But before we do that, I know a little bit earlier you mentioned that obviously there's not one universal definition of consent, at least in the law. And so, you're in Canada, I'm in California. I just wanted to read the definition in California for consent, because I just think California does so many things really well when it comes to the law. So I like that they say that, consent must be affirmative A lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent, nor does silence mean consent. Affirmative consent must be ongoing throughout a sexual activity and can be revoked at any time. And one reason why I like that so much is that it just encapsulates a lot of everything that you've been saying, really, is that just because someone's silent or they don't protest or they don't say no, it doesn't mean that there actually is consent, and then it must be affirmative. So anyway, I just wanted to read that because I just thought it just encapsulated consent so well. So getting to grooming, let's touch on that because I know you have to leave in a few minutes. Let's talk about that because I know that many times from my knowledge of abuse that it doesn't happen always in the very first instant that your child meets someone, that it's someone that they trust and they've come to know this person and they've developed a relationship with them.
Yeah. Yeah. So grooming is really important for parents to understand what it is. Most parents don't know what it is because they don't know the statistic. They think it's like stranger danger or, like you said, it's going to happen in an instant. Usually what happens is that an offender works to gain the trust of not just the child, but also the parents. The parents are the gatekeepers, right? So they're also trying to build trust with the parents so that then the child can trust them. Because typically when a child sees that a parent trusts another adult, that automatically means that they can trust that adult, right? So they are simultaneously working to gain the trust of both the parent and the child, and to gain that one-on-one access. And so that can happen in many different ways. Some of those grooming signs can be that person is trying to offer babysitting, or any kind of free childcare, or, just be super helpful. Oh, I can, pick them up from school and bring them home. And that, car ride can be that one-on-one access that they're looking for. So they're looking to really help in whatever way they can to offer babysitting or free childcare. So that can be one strategy for gaining access to the child. Another is that they start to give the child lots of gifts, whether it is, very openly or secretly. And that can be, big gifts or small gifts. That can happen offline. It can happen online. This is a strategy that gets favor with the child. Another one is, lavishing a lot of attention to the child, being very, like whatever the parent is not, they're trying to fill that gap. So if the parent is very strict, they're going to be very permissive. If the, parent has certain rules, they're going to let the child have, those treats that maybe they wouldn't normally be, allowed at home. And then there is some aspect of secret keeping. So that, usually starts with trying to make it seem like it's an innocent secret. Like if I give you this treat before dinner, don't tell your parents. It'll be our little secret. And then that starts to create sort of this special relationship that the offender is trying to create, right? And this will be something between us. That will lead to a couple of things. One is that it proves to the offender that child can be targeted. They're willing to keep a secret. They haven't been educated about secret safety. So that child will definitely be put on the list of, this is a child that I can continue grooming. So, there's a whole list. There's about 10 different things, that you can look for, but those are some of the most, prominent signs of grooming. And if you see those in conjunction with a gut feeling that something is off, that's likely a sign that this is potentially an unsafe person, and you want to limit that one-on-one access to that person and see how they respond. Talk to that adult for sure about the fact that you are teaching body safety in your home, that you're teaching secret safety. Like, you want to make sure that you're being vocal with that person so that they understand that your child's not going to be an easy target and that you're a vigilant parent, and that will reduce the likelihood of that person targeting your child. So a lot of these grooming signs can happen over a very long period of time. Unfortunately, offenders are very patient. A typical offender is grooming anywhere between 10 to 50 children at a time to see which is going to be the easiest target. Yeah. They're looking for what is the easiest target? Who can I, go after? So there's, those are some of the things that we need to look out for. And that can happen by, family members. It can happen by teachers, coaches, youth serving organization, youth leaders, religious leaders. So it really can happen at the hands of anyone. And in particular, the last person that we're going to suspect is someone who is an upstanding citizen. So
Right.
I want to caution parents to think, oh, well, that person, I mean, he's like, the leader of the, youth group, like
Right.
that
Because it
person
seems
couldn't possibly.
yeah, because it seems like abusers put themselves in trusted positions so that they
Very
can gain
much.
the trust, right? I mean, all of this just makes me physically sick, but that's what I've noticed.
Yeah. Yeah. If you look at, high profile cases like Larry Nassar, I mean, here is a person who, talk about an upstanding citizen. He founded an autism foundation. He was, top of his class and, perceived as a leader in the gymnastics, league. And it was just a lot of red flags that you can see in retrospect, how he really tried to make himself look like no one could ever suspect that this person would do something like that. And yet
Right.
hundreds of girls were abused by him. So it's
Right.
just,
And I've heard about, oh yeah, I've just heard about teachers, that it's common for teachers to abuse students. And obviously we all know about priests abusing kids as well. And it just seems like a theme that they tend to be someone that people say, oh, they would never do that, or they're in that trusted position. And then that's what leads to the trust. And then ultimately, unfortunately, and it's disgusting, the abuse as well. So I know that we're almost out of time. You mentioned secret safety. Maybe you could just give a quick definition of that before we can run through the book recommendations. I want to make sure that we don't miss that.
Yeah, so secret safety is really key because, as we mentioned earlier, like secrets are how offenders will test a child to see if they are targetable. And so if a child has language to share that they don't keep secrets in their home, that can be a really powerful deterrent to a potential offender. So we want to teach kids the difference between secrets, surprises, and privacy, and essentially say, there's no such thing as a good secret. If someone's asking you to keep a secret, it's important that you come and talk to me and let me know so that I can educate that person, because they don't know about secret safety. So it really helps the child feel safe to share, and that, that person's not necessarily going to get in trouble for telling me something, so the child feels safe to share it. So we want to teach kids the difference. Like secrets are things that someone asks you to keep that you're not supposed to ever tell anyone. Sometimes those secrets can make you feel bad. Other times they may seem like okay secrets, but they're not, because if someone's asking you not to share it ever, then that means that it's not an okay secret. Surprises, on the other hand, have a timeline, right? They have an expiry date. They are meant to be shared at a certain time, and they make everyone involved feel good, right? So that's really the main distinction between those two things. Privacy is a whole other category that is more of like, what's information that belongs to you that you don't necessarily want to share, but it doesn't necessarily pertain to anyone else. So for young kids, it could be like, well, I don't want people to know that I still sleep with my stuffy, and so I don't want to share that information. It's like, okay, that's fine. That's private information that belongs to you. So helping kids kind of understand and distinguish those differences is really helpful. And then having a secret safety rule, like we don't keep secrets in our home. And when someone asks you to keep a secret, you can tell them that, and then come and tell me that they asked you to, keep that secret. So that's essentially secret safety. But I also have a workshop if anyone's interested in diving deeper, that helps explain the concept of like tricky people and what is a safe person, so that parents can understand, how to explain that further to their kids.
Yeah, so let's just quickly talk about all the resources that you have, and then also the books too, because I saw a reel on Instagram on your page that you shared that had, I forgot how many, like a handful or more consent books for kids that they're age appropriate. And I ordered them for my daughter, and I've been reading them to her. And I can tell that she's thinking when I read them to her, like I can see it in her eyes that the wheels are turning in her brain,
Right.
and I can tell that it's registering with her. And so that makes me really happy. So can you just discuss
awesome.
the resources that you have, and then also that are available online?
Sure. Yeah. So I love books. They're my go-to. I always recommend that to parents because it gives you the language that you didn't have growing up, right? Like most parents didn't grow up learning this stuff. So it gives you that information that you can then start to use in fun ways for kids. So I have a free PDF that is on my website. You can download it for free. And it gives you a breakdown of body safety books that I recommend based on age. And at the end of that list, there's also books for parents to read for themselves to kind of give them, more information about what are the kinds of things that they should be learning about and then teaching their child as it relates to sex ed, for example, right? Because like you mentioned it earlier, a lot of parents just, that wasn't a word that even was ever said in their home. It was either maybe sex neutral or sex negative, but typically never sex positive. So there's some
Right.
recommendations for that as well. But even for survivor parents, if that's something that you're struggling with, there's some book recommendations in there as well. So lots of tools to help parents get started on this and using books as fun tools to have the language to start teaching what are those appropriate words that we should be using with our kids so that they feel empowered and not scared.
Mm. And one of my favorites is, I see it behind you actually, is the C is for consent, just as a little teaser for parents who are listening. My daughter, it's a little board book actually, and it's very simple. And I was surprised that after the book, I thought that my daughter really wouldn't be interested in really learning more because it's uncomfortable for me. So I assumed it would be uncomfortable for her to talk about. And, it's very kid friendly language. But then there's the discussions at the end of the book that for older kids. And she said, "What are these? Can you read these to me?" Because she knew they were words and
Nice.
she wanted to talk about every single one in depth. And so I thought, wow, this is something that she's really absorbing and it's really important with her. And she wanted to learn more about it because we've never talked about it before. And so she was really interested in it. So anyway, I just wanted to give a little plug for that book. And I assume it's on your list too. So, but
yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Oh, that one's
it's a great book. It's
Yeah.
like you said, yeah, it's simple and it has some great examples that kids can relate to. Some fun visuals. I mean, it's just a really great starter and definitely one of the books that's on my list. And lots of different books are going to touch on different things. You're going to need more than one book, which is why I call it having an abuse prevention library. Because some books are going to cover consent, other books are going to cover boundaries, other books are going to cover private parts, other books are going to cover what are red flags and what to do in those situations, So I also recommend that parents start to teach this in ways that are age appropriate. So we want to start with, those basics that I talked about, body autonomy and boundaries and consent, before we ever get into a conversation about exit strategies, which can feel a lot scarier if kids don't have that really empowering foundation to understand their rights, So if parents are looking for like, what do I teach first, second, and third? I also do have a workshop called Getting Started with Abuse Prevention that walks you through what are the things that you should be teaching at different stages between 0 and 6.
That's perfect. I love that. I'm going to have to check out all of those resources because I didn't even realize about the exit strategy too. So I'm thinking, I have to get into that too. Before we close, I had Googled earlier that California law, and I couldn't find the section too that I really wanted to highlight as well. In addition to the one I already mentioned, was that, in California Penal Code section 261.6, they define consent as a positive cooperation. And that is so important because most consent laws, I don't think, actually say the word positive. And so that's something that I've also been emphasizing with my daughter too. Not my son yet because he's a year and a half, but my daughter, just saying it has to be positive. If, it makes you feel good, makes you feel happy. If something someone's doing to you doesn't make you feel happy or good about yourself, or it makes you feel uncomfortable, that can't be consent. And that's just I wish I would have known that even when I was dating too, just having that mindset. I didn't realize that. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that before closing, that I just think that's so powerful.
I love that. And before you wrap, I just want to say, I think that's really important. The way that parents can look at that as it relates to children is when we talk about, let's say grandma comes over and she wants to hug, Johnny, and Johnny doesn't want to hug. And then grandma suddenly starts acting really sad and pretending to almost cry, to kind of guilt the child into it, this is where we can step in and say, Grandma, I know that you're sad, but just because you're sad doesn't mean that Johnny has to hug, right? Because you can manage your emotions. And then we want to have a conversation with Johnny later and say, you're not responsible for the emotions of others. And that means that just because Grandma was sad doesn't mean that you have to do what Grandma said, because it's your body. And, so this is how that ultimately interprets into the law later in life. And when we start practicing those basic things in the beginning, and we talk to the adults, this is why I always say consent education isn't just for kids, it's also for adults, because most adults weren't taught this. We can start to create consent culture in our home. Yeah. So, exactly. This is how we set the baseline for that kind of understanding when it comes to consent. It cannot be coerced, manipulated. And those are the kinds of ways that we can help children to start understanding that.
And I like about what you said too, about not being responsible for other people's feelings, because I think a lot of us were more raised with the people pleasing attitude of just being more mindful of other people's feelings and being polite as opposed to our own feelings. And that's something that I think is so important to teach kids, is that your comfort level, your feelings matter in that situation too. Actually, they're most important, right? Is how you feel about a situation, not the other person. So I think
for sure. Important. I mean, if we don't teach that early on, when kids get into relationships in their, into intimate relationships in their teen years, this is why consent is so blurry for a lot of kids. They don't understand if this person really loves me and they're asking me to do this, even though I don't want to, I feel responsible for making them happy, because that's how I grew up. Grandma wanted a kiss, even though I didn't want to give her a kiss, I still had to, because I didn't want to see her sad, and nobody told me otherwise. So these things have real world consequences, and educating those adults and giving them those examples to help them understand and see the future of how this, this creates these implications, can really be a powerful way for them to shift and help support your abuse prevention education, instead of pushing back and saying, this doesn't make sense to me, or just continuing to be manipulative. And if they are going to continue to be that way, then that you have to set a harder boundary with those people, because they are setting the precedent for your child on what's okay and not okay.
Gosh, I feel like I could talk to you forever about this, because I'm just thinking in my head, that probably trickles on to adult relationships and who you end up marrying, and if you're going to end up in an abusive marriage and all these situations, like verbally abusive, physically, all these things. So anyway, I know that's a different topic for a different day, but it's just so important, this topic, just laying the foundation for everything in life to set your kid up for success in the future. So thank you so much.
Healthy relationships.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Rosalia, for coming on the show. And where can people find you online, on social media?
Yeah. So again, thanks for having me. This was a great conversation. So I can be found at consentparenting.com. That's my website. And on Instagram and Facebook, Consent Parenting is the handle. And on Twitter, it's just Consent Parent. So they wouldn't let me add the ing.
Sounds good. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm definitely going to be checking out all those additional resources. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you again.